What's up, nerds? American diplomats and spies are under attack abroad and here at home. This is an issue that has a lot of secrecy around it, especially around who and how these attacks are happening. And this is all known colloquially as the Havana Syndrome. Now, we've actually just learned a lot about Havana Syndrome and what might be behind it in a recent collaboration between Der Spiegel, 60 Minutes, and The Insider. And The Insider is basically a magazine that is written by Russian exiles. So we're going to talk about this crazy story and some of the gaps that this story ends up leaving, but also some of the questions that it might be answering and that it leaves behind. Now, for those of you that are not aware, the Havana Syndrome is really a collection of symptoms that kind of encapsulates this health phenomena, or what the government is calling anomalous health incidents, or AHIs. Now, the reason it's called the Havana Syndrome is because this became more widely known after an attack on U.S. staff in the embassy in Havana. It became called the Havana Syndrome thereafter, but that actually was not the first case. The article from The Insider talking about this talks about how there was an attack in Munich just a couple years ahead of the Havana incident, and so really this isn't anything new. Now, these symptoms include, but are not limited to, ringing of the ears, nausea and vomiting, vertigo, migraines, loss of balance, memory loss, and vision damage. This is all due to unexplained damage to the brain, as well as damage to some of the structures in the ear and behind the eye. And this is a suspected reason for these attacks is long believed to be microwave beams. However, the attackers behind this has not been known. And that takes us to the article by The Insider and the piece with 60 Minutes. And I'm going to have links to both the 60-minute videos as well as the Insider article in the description for you to check out as well. This video is not going to be a complete coverage of what all they talk about. Really, we're just going to cover the key points, and then we're going to kind of ask some key questions of these pieces of media. Now, let's talk about these incidents, because we know of some incidents abroad, but it might have actually also been happening here in the United States. 60 Minutes released a couple pieces on this, one where they discussed incidents where U.S. intelligence and diplomatic staff have been targeted in countries like Germany, Cuba, Russia, China, and beyond, as well as diplomatic staff and White House staff here in the United States. They also talked about who could be behind this and how they could be performing these attacks, but we're going to talk about that here in just a moment. But these attacks did include targeting of both U.S. intelligence and diplomatic staff, as well as senior White House staff, to include people that might be close to cabinet level staff. In fact, 60 Minutes interviews both the former National Security Advisor John Bolton as well as the current CIA chief William Burns, and both had personal experience helping victims of these attacks as they were being targeted. Some of the victims of these attacks have actually been medically retired because their symptoms were so severe. Other victims are still receiving treatment, and many of these victims have had also their spouses and their children targeted as well, some of these children receiving permanent damage. Overall, it's reported that over 1,000 Americans and others have been targeted in these attacks. Not just Americans, but some Canadians as well. Now, this takes us to the Insider article, which really dives into a lot of evidence on who might be behind this attack. That takes us to the Russian GRU Unit 29155. And this is basically Russia's elite hitmen that work for their intelligence services. They've operated all around the world. Their resume includes some pretty high-level and key bombings, attempted coups, as well as several high-level poisonings, including the poisonings of Sergei and Yulia Skripal in the UK a few years ago, as well as of Alexei Navalny. Now, the Insider article spends the majority of the time kind of uncovering the GRU operatives that they believe were behind some of these attacks, basically linking them to different travel records where a lot of these operatives were in the same city at the same time as some of these attacks were taking place. This article includes suspicious flight patterns, like, for example, flights of some GRU personnel from Moscow to Kazakhstan and back from Kazakhstan to Moscow, which they assert were decoy flights, which covered flights from Kazakhstan to Tbilisi, Georgia, which basically bracketed the time where an attack took place in Tbilisi, Georgia, targeting U.S. staff at that time. I will say that this article and the information that it provides is not proof in and of itself. It's damning evidence, but it is not proof, and we're going to get to more about that here in just a moment. The Insider also discusses articles that they've uncovered of development within Russia and formerly the Soviet Union into microwave weaponry and weaponry designed to target adversaries in a non-lethal manner, but also potentially in a lethal manner using microwave particles. One of the key documents that they uncovered was a pretty significant reward to one of the senior developers, and that senior developer had ties to, you guessed it, Unit 29155. Now, it does need to be stated that this capability, this ability to launch microwave projectiles at an individual or at a target, is not just unique to Russia. Other countries are believed to have this capability as well, including China and the United States. Basically, what this capability is it fires focused particles at a specific target, and that target can be behind objects like bricks, concrete, and glass, and those particles just shoot right through that. The Insider and 60 Minutes assert that these devices have been used to target U.S. staff both in their homes and apartments where they live, as well as in their offices where they go to work. Now, overall, this story is interesting, but it is very troubling. None of it is proof in and of itself, but it is certainly some pretty damning evidence. But that does not explain every single case. Like I said before, there are over 1,000 reported cases, and these articles do not go to explain every single one of them. A lot of it might just be anecdotal, and this takes us to what William Burns said in his 60 Minutes interview, where basically he doesn't want to make any kind of official attribution. And I think that the weight of these claims is pretty large. The weight of the claims of, Russia targeting U.S. personnel and injuring them, some of them permanently, some of them their spouses and their children permanently, that's very troubling. The weight of those claims, that we have to understand what that potentially means, because that is the deliberate targeting of diplomatic staff, people that are not involved in clandestine operations, people that are there for, economic development, diplomatic, work, other things like that, as well as senior U.S. decision makers in and around the White House. That is ballsy, one, but also it's significant in showing how far Russia might be willing to go if it is in fact them. However, again, we're talking largely about anecdotal evidence, and evidence that it may be circumstantial. It is not proof in and of itself. And so we need to look at this through a critical lens because the implications of this are very vast. And I think that that's why William Burns is kind of hedging his attribution here. There was a report by the intelligence community that did not lay any kind of official blame. In fact, it stated that the intelligence community does not believe that an adversary is responsible or behind these kinds of symptoms. But at the same time, again, we're talking about anecdotal evidence in these articles that it could be real. It might be Russia, and I think that we can kind of read between the lines here on what's going on. But at the same time, again, the implications are such that you need to be 100% sure. You can't read between the lines and basically potentially walk your way to war. You have to know 100% what happened that was true, and that that the facts that you understand are real facts. And I think that that's something that we're seeing from the intelligence community, that they just aren't sure enough to give attribution to anybody yet. And this kind of dilemma is what has left a lot of victims feeling gaslit and abandoned by the U.S. government. And I think that that's completely understandable. Truly, more evidence is needed, but troublingly, how are we going to collect that evidence without there being more attacks? The Insider kind of goes into the physics of these attacks and the biology on what happens after these attacks happen to the targeted individual. A lot of that evidence goes away incredibly quickly. If you aren't measuring before, during, and after the attack, you're going to have a very hard time proving that what somebody is suffering is an example of Havana Syndrome, or that they were targeted. You have the testimony on what they're saying and what they're telling you and what they're physically experiencing. But again, when we're talking about implications of this magnitude, you've got to have some sort of substantive evidence. Now, the full impacts of these attacks on the subjects themselves, the targets, the individuals that have been victimized by this, that's still unknown. We know that some have had deterioration of bones and ligaments in their head since these attacks. Many have been medically discharged from government work and medically retired. Some have had permanent damage done to their eyesight, their hearing, their ability to function day to day since these attacks. And some of those people are their children. But long term, over years and decades of this kind of damage, we still don't even know what the damage could be to these individuals. In fact, I mentioned before that Russian research into these weapons was designed for non-lethal effects. However, some of the documentation even suggests that it could have lethal impacts. What happens if a senior U.S. decision maker is killed by one of these devices? And there's over 1,000 cases already right now. What happens if some of those individuals unfortunately start to pass away as a result of the injuries that they've sustained from these attacks? Now, I mentioned before that some of these victims are Canadian. Now, is it the same threat group, the same threat actor that is behind all of these attacks? And is it that same actor that is targeting those countries as well? We know that other countries might have this capability, so why can't it be some of those countries as well? Or are we even sure that it is just Unit 29155? Or are there other elements, even if this is Russia, within the Russian military or intelligence services that are also facilitating and conducting these attacks? I think Unit 29155 is certainly one of the most logical actors that could be behind this, given their track record, given their capability, and given the scope of who all has been attacked. You know, both 60 Minutes and The Insider discussed that the targeted individuals seem to have some kind of relationship. Either they are heavily knowledgeable of Russia, they've worked in and around Russia before, they have supported the intelligence community and worked against Russian operations in Ukraine. And some of these attacks might be retribution operations against some of those intelligence officers and diplomats. Again, like I said, we can read between the lines and know exactly who we're talking about here and who might be behind this attack. But again, we're talking about potentially lethal attacks on U.S. diplomats and U.S. decision makers that has significant implications and ramifications. So we need to be 100% sure that it's them. Now, I've seen some pushback online against this article and its assertion that Russia's behind this. After all, some have said that if this was in fact Russia, then why aren't they targeting Ukraine with these kinds of devices? And I think potentially they would be, but also I'm not quite sure that that makes much sense. After all, to launch these attacks, you have to get pretty close to the target. The Insider reports that these devices have a range of around 100 meters, but for some of them, you have to get as close to 10 to 15 meters away from your target. Now, if you're going to get that close in wartime, you may as well just use something lethal. Russia doesn't want to target, like, say, Zelensky or other Ukrainian decision makers with non-lethal effects. They want to kill those individuals. So if they're going to get that close to either of those individuals, they're going to have to get that close with some sort of a lethal effect to get the kind of impact on the war that they want. It just doesn't make sense for them to use a device like this in wartime. Now, from a clandestine point of view, this weapon kind of makes perfect sense to use because, again, there's little evidence of its use. It's something that can be used through walls and glass. Basically, as has been reported in some of these cases, they could basically just post up in a side road or in an alleyway, fire the microwave into the living quarters, and then take off. And really, there's not going to be a lot of evidence to pin exactly who was behind that attack. Some have also stated that Russia is not the only country with this capability, so why can't it be other countries? And I think that may be true. The travel records of what these articles are pointing to points to Unit 29155, and that's not proof, but it is also way more evidence than we have of any other actor. Still, some have talked about how this whole thing, the fact that the U.S. is not willing to actually attribute these attacks to any one group, might be part of a larger U.S. government cover-up. Some have said, including the articles that discuss this issue, discuss the U.S. intelligence community assessment that this isn't the result of any kind of foreign adversary. And some of this might actually be due, like I've said before, about a lack of evidence firmly pinning any of these one groups to their direct involvement in these attacks. Now, I wonder if some of the lack of the public attribution for these attacks is part of the concern of what exactly it would mean for the United States broadly if it were true that these attacks were done by a group like, say, Russia. But if that was the case, I would imagine that we would be seeing different kinds of messaging coming from the United States and from the intelligence community that would kind of tell us that they are kind of, at least more privately or in a secret capacity, confirming that this is Russia. So far, the only acknowledgement that we've really gotten from the U.S. government on these attacks is whenever the press pushes them on this issue. In this case, the victims are claiming that the government just wants this whole thing swept under the rug. And that could be because the government doesn't want to have to pay out victims the financial compensation that they're due. Some of them do a lot of money in medical bills and other kinds of just liability coverage that they get from what's happened. But some of it also could be because it makes the intelligence agencies look bad. I mean, they are some of the premier intelligence agencies in the world, and they're not coming to a cohesive conclusion on who is launching these attacks. It also makes them look bad because it makes it look like they cannot protect their staff enough. And that's not just the intelligence community, that's the State Department. A lot of these staff are put in very dangerous environments. But even in the safe environments, like Germany, you would associate with it being a war zone or a place where you can get hurt. Even domestically here in the United States, if you can be targeted with something like this where you can get permanent damage done to your body, but not just your body, but your spouse's body and your children's bodies, and no one's going to know who did it, you're not going to have that kind of closure, and you may not even get the compensation for your injuries. That's not only going to have issues in the reputations of these agencies, making them look like they're not reliable or trustworthy, but also, and that's going to cause some recruitment problems. I mean, why join some of these agencies whenever you don't feel confident that they'll protect you or that they'll cover you once you've been injured? I think that's all understandable, but I think that denying this is really going to let this problem get even worse. The more people that get attacked, the worse it's going to look. Again, it's not that straightforward, and the results of knowing who attacked for sure and applying that kind of attribution publicly, that could take us to some pretty bad places. But with all of that, I want to know your thoughts on this. What do you think is going on? Who do you think is behind this based on the information in these articles? Let me know what you think down in the video comments. Let's continue this conversation. Like this video if you thought it was informative, and subscribe to this channel for more analysis on international affairs and conflict and these topics. With all that, I'll see you all later. Bye.